From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Trees play a very important role in pollinator health. You may recall from earlier episodes with Dr. Stephen Frank or with Dr. Gail Ungalato, trees have these real critical roles in urban landscapes. They're cooling the landscape down. They provide habitat, homes for the bees, but also floral resources. The problem is it's really hard to study pollinator behavior in trees. The canopy is way up high in many of these trees, and the visitation of some of these bees may be very early in the spring. And that's why I was so excited to catch up with my next guest, Kass Urban-Mead. She's a PhD student in the Danforth Lab and McCart Lab at the University of Cornell. She's got some really innovative ways of getting up into those canopies, and she's finding some fascinating things that we previously didn't know about pollinators in trees. So let's head up, way up, with Kass Urban-Mead on pollination. All right, I'm really pleased here in California, way far from both our homes. I'm talking to Kass Urban-Mead about your research on pollinators in trees. Welcome to Pollination.
Thank you so much. It's exciting to be here.
Okay, so we often think, when I think about, we've had so many shows and we talk to people about pollinators, and whenever we think about plants, we're often talking about forbs. Sometimes we've had people talk about shrubs. I think I can only think of one episode where we ever talked about trees.
About trees, yeah.
Are trees important for pollinators, or why should we think about trees?
I think trees are really important for pollinators. I like to say I study the bees in the trees, and I think that's,
I guess, let me rephrase that. We're going to, this episode's going to be totally about how important trees are.
Yeah.
Why are trees overlooked?
Oh, well, I think a large part of it is because they're overlooking us. They're way high up there. It's hard to get into them. It's hard to see them. And so I think really naturally, as creatures who are, 4 to 6 feet tall, we end up really just focusing on the beautiful plants at our feet and around us that we can see. We see are buzzing with flowers. And so to take that extra energy, physically, literally to get 70 feet in the sky can be a big barrier. And so our human perspective bias is limited that way.
Okay, I can totally get that. And I often see this, out in Oregon when the maples start blooming, I could see there's some low branches and I can sort of see something going on. I have no idea what's going on beyond that.
Absolutely. And I think that the reason we ended up, I was supported by my advisors to dive into this project was because we had some other data that kind of was telling us, hey, you guys should be looking up. And that had to do with kind of consistent trends that pollinators were healthier and more abundant and more diverse in agricultural areas where we were focused when there was forest nearby. And so that could be, of course, for a variety of reasons, nesting or, many things, but it could be forage resources that we're not thinking about. And also anecdotal data that I've tracked down, and particularly one cool study by Laura Rousseau, who was a former postdoc, now professor in Brian Danforth's lab, and she was looking at the scopal loads, so the pollen that bees had collected on their legs off of, and they were all collected right on apple trees in the middle of apple bloom, and a large proportion of them had up to 30 or 40% of tree pollen, including wind-pollinated tree pollen.
Okay, let me get this straight. So these bees are, there's a forest nearby, and they're in apples. They're going from flower to flower, and you take the pollen off their back leg or off their belly or whatever.
Exactly.
And you look at it, and it's 30 to 40% trees, and some of those are not even trees that benefit from pollination.
Exactly. And so I was looking at those data wow, these are the farms nearby us. I had just learned to climb trees. And
Really?
I was like, yeah. One of the cool things about Cornell is that it actually offers a tree climbing course. And I was my first fall in Ithaca, and I was like, well, shoot, I got to take this tree climbing course. And I also had gone to forestry school, and I cared a lot about forests and trees, and I was interested in their ecology. So I was like, well, maybe sometime in the future this will help me do some research. Who knows? And as I was climbing trees for class and looking through old data sets that Laura and Brian had in the lab, I was realizing, wow, these places I'm climbing are going to be flowering, some of them in the spring. And Laura has this evidence that they're collecting some of it. But that was in mid-May. We're in New York State, where things bloom in May. And the trees are often blooming starting at the end of March, the beginning of April. And so I said to my advisors, hey, if this project falls through, the summer is still there, I can do another project. But what if I take my first spring and just see what's going on up there? And luckily they're really supportive and went out on a limb, so to speak, to let me let me do that project. So I climbed up with my net a bunch to really see if that pollen collection we were seeing in the apple orchards was also reflected earlier in the season, before our crops were even blooming, were those bees that had come out using those resources.
Oh, yeah. So I guess that's one thing. There's all sorts of trees. In Oregon this summer, we had catalpa, beautiful, massive trees with those massive flowers. But we have some summer bloomers, but we have the bulk of our trees, our deciduous trees, are going to be producing pollen and or nectar in the before anything else.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Huge abundance of pollen. Yep. There's a couple studies, and actually it's mostly from the allergen literature that you get calculations of really the number of pollen grains that a wind pollinated tree can produce. And so they're usually pitched at like, this is terrifying. Like, did you know that an oak tree can produce almost, billions and billions of grains of pollen? And but it means that some of those curves are out there, and you think, wow, like, we know that wild bees, especially solitary bees, are collecting as much pollen as they can to rear an offspring on. And we know that bees are pollen eaters, not just pollinators, right? They're going out to eat that pollen.
Oh, I suppose that's. I love that you can actually sound mostly almost the same.
It sounds almost the same, yeah.
Just because they're
going for nectar too, but they need that pollen for the protein, for the lipids, for their offspring.
So those trees, those wind pollinated trees, still have to produce this pollen, and so the bees, if they can get it, they can use that and they can eat it, even though the plant doesn't intend to.
Totally.
Or the plant doesn't even use that, doesn't need the insect for to visit.
Right. And I think they're producing that huge abundance for all the reasons we know wind pollinated trees are looking to get, maximal numbers of pollen grains floating out. And they're hoping for statistics that their pollen grains are going to land on the correct host flower. But it means that they're producing huge amounts of small, light pollen. And we wouldn't necessarily think that bees would use those because they're not sticky. They might not be producing pollen kit, and they might not be adapted to pack well on the legs of bees. So a priori, we're not sure that they would be using those resources because they're not part of that traditional evolutionary dance of, waiting for a pollinator. And so traits that are good for pollinators to be able to scrabble through and collect them. But there's enough evidence in the literature that they are collecting them, sometimes up to 100%. I just learned there's even an oak specialist, Andrina, in Europe. There's studies on osmia that are like about thermal tolerance and totally other questions, but they happened to note down what kinds of pollen they were finding, and it would be up to 95% oak pollen. And so there's little scattered evidence throughout the literature, that really they are going to use those. It just hasn't ever been studied because it's hard to get there.
Can I just take us down a quick bunny trail?
Sure,
So the one thing that you said was that pollen from trees doesn't pack well, that are not...
It might not, yeah.
It might not, but to explain what that's all about, just if you can't... I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, so I need to... Yeah, the mechanics of different bees. So we know that bees are fuzzy vegetarian wasps, and part of the way that they're fuzzy is that they have branched hairs. Yeah. And so each hair is like the branch of a tree with other little hairs off of it, and that makes a structure that's really good for pollen adhesion and to catch on. Yeah. But different types of bees have different like hair adaptations that mean that different types of pollen will pack well. So like there's certain Andrina that are Enothera specialists that have certain types of corbicula that match the morphology and match quote unquote, right? they work well because they've had an association over millions of years to collect that kind of pollen.
Okay, so the actual pollen may be adapted to, and so, okay, all right.
Right, there's going to be selection over time if those species are relying on each other that they can work. And so because trees don't rely on the insects, one could imagine that those small grains that are really intended to fly through the air, hundreds of miles, maybe even, to get onto another tree might not be the best for packing into a scopal load unless you mix them. But it seems that many bees are able to, basically, is what we're finding.
Okay, thank you for
and
that.
not because I've studied the mechanics of it at all, but I would love to. That would be a really cool follow-up study.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
yeah.
Thank you for that diversion.
No, it's really cool. Yeah.
Let's take a quick break, and then I want to come back, and I want to ask you about specifically what you were doing up in those trees.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, and we're back. So there's you've explained this both the difficulties of studying the role of tree for bees, but also the potential importance. Can you tell us a little bit? So you talked before the break. You told us about climbing trees and taking a tree climbing class.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your design. What kind of trees and what context were you looking at them?
Absolutely. So in the New York Finger Lakes region, where Ithaca and Cornell University are, we've been working on a variety of small to large orchards in the area, and many of those in our kind of patchy, heterogeneous landscape, it's a lot of deciduous second growth forest, and we have lots of small lots where an orchard will be maybe also near an old field meadow and also near an old woodlot.
Oh.
And so this kind of woodlot adjacent to orchard is a really common situation. And I think that I worked on a bunch of orchards when I was, in between things in a couple seasons. And often I found that we think of in these agricultural systems, these woods are like homes where the pests overwinter.
Oh, yeah.
And so for me, it was like really kind of upending and exciting to think, wow, like plum curculio might be there, but also maybe that's where our pollinators are when the trees aren't blooming.
Yeah.
And so... yeah, those forests, they're oak hickory, they're heavily sugar and red maple.
Okay.
A lot of understory hop hornbeam, occasional linden, tulip tree, and then there's also beech forest.
Sounds lovely.
So yeah, it's a beautiful area. It's a great place to work, and orchards are of course magical. So it's a great combination.
Okay, so you found these woodlots that were adjacent to apple orchards.
Yes.
And then what did you do?
Yeah, so we talked about tree climbing already, which was my inspiration. It's when I saw that really there were a lot of bees out in those trees. When you're climbing a tree, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and that's wonderful. But also, I was finding that as a tree climber, even though I'm like reasonably small and reasonably nimble, you can't get to the very edge of those trees. And I was seeing that I was in blossoms, right? I was like, oh, I'm sitting in this cluster of red maple blossoms, 55 feet above the ground, fantastic. And then, another 20 feet out from me on the very edge of the canopy, I could see more bee activity, even more. And like, it looked like more diversity, more of the bigger bees. And I was like, this is a subset of the community. So to climb a tree, you use a giant slingshot, which is like a 7-foot pole with a huge rubber band, and put a weight in it attached to a slippery thin rope, and you crouch down on one knee, pull that giant rubber band, release the rope, and it flies into the air. And if your aim is good, which mine got better and better and better,
You're joking.
You'd get it for climbing, you get it between a strong crotch of a tree, where then once that weight lands on the other side, you tie on a heavy rope, reel it over, and then you can fix that and climb in that heavy rope.
I'm so looking forward to reading the methods section of your paper.
I know, it condenses down to like one line, right? Like we set up a pulley system. So then because I wanted replicated data where I didn't have to put in all of the effort of climbing each tree, I wanted continuous sampling in multiple locations. I used that same slingshot system instead to aim at the edge of the canopy where I saw those blooms that had the most activity, and launch that rope and then pull up what ended up being a pulley system with a typical yellow, white, and blue bowl trap but I tied them onto the ropes.
Okay, so these are these little traps you put a little soapy water in.
Exactly.
And I can just imagine on a pulley system, you must be able to also bus like a really good party with like champagne glasses.
It is. It's a very funny. My neck hurt by the end of my field season from craning to look up 70 feet in the sky and like guide the bowls down through all the branches without spilling anything. I got pretty good at it.
That's amazing.
It was really fun.
Cool. Okay.
And that meant I didn't need a safety buddy all the time, and so it was really cool. I'd bring my extra length of rope out so that I could release the pulley and reel it all the way down. So I'd tie on my extra length of rope and then pull down the bowl system, empty it out, collect my bees into whirl packs in ethanol, put those in my bag, and then reset the soapy water, reel them back up. And so I had last year, for my first year, 6, my second year, 11, and this year, 9 sites that each were 5 paired bowl systems in the forest and the canopy adjacent to orchards, which also had 5 bowl sets.
So you had them in the trees, you had them down at the forest floor, and then you had them in the floor of the canopy of the floor of the
in
apple?
the branches. So basically, in each habitat, I kind of chose where we think the flowers are. And so they're up in the canopy, on average 65, 70 feet high, and these oak and hickory overstories near maple.
Okay, so there's
in
flowers
the sub-canopy.
there.
Exactly. And then also in the understory, because we have a lot of beautiful spring ephemerals.
So there's and then the flowers on the orchard. So you're like,
and flowers in the orchard.
You're like, flower up. Where are the bees? Are they in the flowers in the woodlot? Are they on the flowers on the floor? Are they in the flowers of the apple orchard?
Exactly. And I kept those out the whole time because they bloom at different times, and I want to see, are they just flying through and getting caught in the bowls? Or are they really showing up during bloom?
Yeah.
Because just being there doesn't mean they're eating them. And so first I was just looking at who is where and when.
Okay.
And that's been exciting.
What did you find?
Yeah. Our apple system is super diverse. In the Finger Lakes region, we have at least 80 species of bees that visit apple orchards. In the whole of New York State, at least 120.
Okay.
That's 10 years of sampling from the Danforth lab. And so I was like, wow, I wonder how many of those are in the forest.
Yeah.
And I found at least 40 to 55 species, depending on my site, in my forest canopies.
Really?
And that's really exciting. Almost all of them so far, they're not all identified to species because I have a ton of Dialectus and a ton of male Andrena, which are tricky to identify.
Oh, we had a show with Sam Drogi, and it was his, I think, his most hated taxa.
I know. It's like even Sam Drogi doesn't like Dialectus. I actually kind of love them, but they are hard to ID.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of sorting through the exact species resolution of it all, but it seems like almost everything, 100% at the genus level overlap in terms of community. But I'm finding sex ratio differences is one really strong thing that jumps out in terms of when species, or at least genera, are using those 2 different habitats. And so I think that that's a really important thing to think about, is there's that phenological.
I'm going to just
predict.
I would imagine the male bees would be in the orchard because that's where the nectar plants are, and they wouldn't be in the forest canopy because that's primarily just a pollen source. Is that what you found?
So we found exactly the opposite.
Oh, man. How is that possible?
But it is really interesting because I think traditionally the view is that male bees rely on just some sugar from nectar to power their bodies through mating, and then they die, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely what I always thought. But another factor that's playing in here is the temporal component, because in early spring, especially a lot of these Andrena, if we zoom in on the Andrena, who are highly effective apple pollinators and often early spring, only out for several weeks, the whole species.
Yeah.
The males emerge earlier, and then the females emerge later. So there's enough overlap for mating, but the males are really active and out first. And so that also seems to overlap with the forest habitat is where they're active first, and then the orchards later. The females
that's going
pick
to
up.
bloom first. It's going to bloom before the apple orchard.
So there's a phenological effect also.
Okay.
But in terms of which resources they're using, so we found a lot of males and females active in the canopy. And the next thing that I'm doing is looking at the pollen that they've eaten and figuring out exactly what the different preferences are. So that's my next step. But just already, who had eaten a lot of pollen, both of them had really consumed a lot of pollen just by taking out those guts and looking at who had eaten a lot of pollen.
We always think about how, I guess the central dogma of my, the pollination podcast is that the bees collect pollen and they feed it to their young. They don't eat it themselves.
Right. There's definitely literature where we know that female bees need to eat pollen in order, because they're continuously producing and laying eggs.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so physiologically
they need the protein for that. Okay,
exactly.
Yeah.
So that wasn't super surprising, and I was really hopeful. Basically, I would never have thought of doing gut dissections. It was really kind of a like, whoa, I really want to know not just that the bees are up here, not just the vertical stratification and occupancy, but I really want to know what they're eating and what they're doing up there and if they're foraging. And somebody who actually worked with, I don't even remember, something else, was like, dissect them, look what's in their guts. And it was like, well, why not? The females at least will eat a ton of pollen. They're laying eggs. And I started dissecting the males too, and they just have tons of pollen in their guts. Up to 50% of the males, especially in the canopy and the orchard, where you imagine they've been out for a little while. In the ground, a lot of them didn't have pollen in their guts, but it would be pretty easy for them to have just come out of their nests and just kind of fallen in a bowl.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, and so they maybe they're relying on it more, maybe they're up there doing something else in the canopy looking for females, and they end up eating a lot. But they're really I'm seeing diversity in the pollen types that they've eaten, and a lot of pollen.
Okay, and so I guess when it comes to conservation and thinking about these woodlots, I mean, kind of right back to the beginning, like people thought, oh, these places are just where bees nest. They go out into the orchard to do all their foraging. But now I guess it's like there's these complications. Not only are these plants, they seem to be providing food for both males and females in terms of pollen sources, but they also seem to be these sexual differences. The males seem to really be using it. And I guess we never think about males. We think about, the males, they'll just mate. But
right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that was I was like, oh, right. Of course, we don't often think about, the other sex in the bees. We're like looking at, we want these pollinators to be here, and this is the habitat I see them on. These are the flowers, and that's all like fantastic. That's like led to a lot of good work. And I had never really, until I did this project and was seeing these stark sex differences in habitat usage, that wow, if we want these full life cycles, we're going to need to also think about the habitats that support the males predominantly. And then if they also have different, so my next step is going to be identifying all these pollen grains. We've been at this conference hearing a lot of people talking about how awful that is, but
we're at the
I'm ready to dive in.
If people thought we were in we were
on vacation in California.
No, International Pollinator Conference. We're in the courtyard. But we've heard a lot of people talking about pollen analysis. It's very tricky. Very tricky.
And I had considered doing some of the really exciting metabarcoding work that I've heard people talk about. And everyone really agrees that as truly exciting all of that work is, it really is limited by being presence-absence. You only know if you have the pollen or not. And I really want to know how much of different species they're relying on. And I want to be able to compare, there's this much oak in the landscape, and this is how much oak this bee collected, and really look at whether their foraging is relative to the abundance and the proportion that was available to them, to get a sense of relative preference. And I might follow this up with some manipulative work, too.
I think you intrepid Oregon Bee Atlas people out there who are listening, I think we never think about, we have a lot of oak in Oregon. I never think of it in terms of a pollen source. I think it'd be really great to sort of follow this up. But I guess there are other people listening to this episode and they're thinking, trees, I should plant more trees.
Absolutely. Always plant more trees.
What would you, I know it's very early in the game and you've got a lot of identification but just based on some of the traps, do any of these tree species stand out?
So let's see. I think there's kind of two levels to my answer to that question. One is if you are a backyard person who's thinking, I want to plant something in my yard now, versus someone who kind of has access to a woodlot or a forested area that they want to be managing for bees. Yeah. And this is all very preliminary, but I think really any tree that blooms is going to do good work for the bees. We think of the flowering fruit trees, we think of locusts, we think of tulip trees, we think of linden, and those are our kind of insect pollinated trees. And I just want people to also think of their wind pollinated trees as resources, especially when they think about where you might spray pesticides. I think all of those trees are going to be doing enormous work, especially because I've seen bees nesting in branches of oak trees and other species.
Oh, there's a dead branch there.
Dead branch up in the canopy. We know that a lot of species use.
I always think of them on the ground.
Exactly, me too. And then I was up in the top of a tree watching these, shiny green bees zipping in and out of a branch at 65 feet high. And I was like, oh gosh, they're nesting up here. here too. So obviously you don't want a dead branch hanging over your house, but if you have a
No,
habitat
of
where
course.
that makes sense.
In a woodlot.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing, like I was at the Forest Landowner Conference in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago and just had some really exciting conversations with people who are managing forests and doing work with community-based forestry and small woodlot owners for bird management. And it just seemed that already, like these are not, official recommendations anywhere, but based on my intuition from this work and talking with other people doing forest bee research, that a lot of the recommendations out there for conserving wildlife in forests already are really similar to things that we'd want for bees, which include mimicking natural disturbances, conserving coarse woody debris, having snags in the forest, meaning standing dead wood that have a lot of beetle burrows in places that are good nesting. Canopy diversity is really important, and so a lot of ecological management is trying to have uneven aged forestry. So we're thinking trees of lots of different ages and sizes, which shelter wood and other uneven age selection forestry practices really highlight. And then you get these kind of, open areas, which traditionally in forests is where we only thought bees were. We're in a recently harvested patch that had rubus and your other, kind of sun patches, and that's absolutely true. But there's also mid-story and older species are going to have these blooms that we've traditionally not thought of as bee resources. They're going to have nesting resources.
Oh my God.
And so I think that actually, it would just be really cool to add the bee component into a lot of the ecological forestry recommendations that already exist, and to get more people who are excited about that kind of conservation work for bees, but maybe aren't bird people, or maybe aren't people who are thinking about grouse or whatever under their forestry projects, other wildlife projects, actually thinking about doing good sustainable forestry is going to up the diversity of our community.
Fantastic.
And it'll have spillover into other habitats, of course.
Well, even if they don't, even if they're under the illusions they're building bird habitat, it's just like, great, awesome.
Yes, totally. I was like, gosh, we should just sync these, there's going to be slight variation, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking about, but now especially I'm finding, even pine pollen in the guts of these bees. And so even these thickets that are recommended for birds of having different, densities and different, anyway, it all just seems like it would dovetail really nicely.
Fantastic research. This is really great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very exciting.
Let's take a break. We've got the 3 questions, the
Oh.
dreaded 3 questions. But
All right.
They'll be okay. And we're back. Okay, so 3 questions. Every guest, nobody gets away without it. First question is,
Yes.
do you have a book that you'd like to recommend?
All right, this one was tricky for me, and then I realized that I have such an exciting book that I want everyone to read, which is that I am in the Brian Danforth's lab at Cornell University, and so I've gotten a sneak peek at his upcoming book on solitary bees, and I can just tell you that that book is packed full of the coolest stories and the most amazing kind of compilation of solitary bee life cycles and habitats and evolutionary theories and why we think they do what they do. It's a really, really great book full of knowledge. It's kind of geared towards an upper level biology student. So it's good for classes. It's good for a researcher who knows science but is psyched to learn more about solitary bees.
We really, there are some good keys out there. But just basic life history. And we do have Michener's book on the social bees.
Oh gosh, yes.
Which is a great book.
Fantastic.
But it really isn't a great resource to sort of pull together all of those varied life history, weird kind of things in one place. This is going to be fantastic.
It's going to be great. I just ran a workshop with undergrads a couple weeks ago, and brought everybody some of the little focal, awesome stories that Brian pulls out in little boxes in the book, bees that nest in termite nests, and bees that are nests are submerged in ponds half the year, and bees that forage by the light of the moon, and they were just what do you mean bees that nest in rock walls only? And and they were like, what do you mean? This can't be a bee. And it was just, a lot of them were stories I'd never heard before. So
you were teaching a kids class on.
They were actually undergrads in a field ecology course.
Oh,
and they asked me to come do a couple-day bee workshop. It was really, really fun.
Well, this is a really great. So the way that we met is you just sent me an email and said that you liked the show, that you listened to the show, but also you let me know that this book is going to be published in September.
Yeah.
and we're going to, thanks to you, we're going to have Dr. Danforth on the show talk about the book just around its release.
Fantastic. Oh, that's so good to hear.
I'm really excited about that. I got I got to see the table of contents in one of the chapters, and it looks amazing.
I think it's going to live up to expectations. I'm glad that the listeners will get to hear all about it.
Fantastic. Okay, so the next question I have for you is, do you have a go-to tool for this very slightly dangerous sounding work that you do?
If it's not a little dangerous, what do you know, is it fun? I guess I'm going to have to just go with my giant slingshot because it's called a big shot. You know how it's awesome.
That's the
brand name.
Big
yeah,
Shot?
I guess I shouldn't be like advertising, but yeah,
Oh,
it's called a big shot.
There's going to be like, there's going to be a run on big shots. They're going to be like, what the heck? It's just all these people. What? And Amazon will do its demographic. They all like bees. I don't get what's going on.
What is happening here? You're like, well, canopy bees. You know, it's time to be up there.
Okay,
so
yeah. How big is this thing? Is it like?
It's 7 feet long, so it's like a long pole.
Oh my God!
It's a huge slingshot. Yeah. So I like lodge the base of it in the ground.
Oh, so you're not holding it. It's kind of like anchored and you're pulling it back.
Exactly. You're like kneeling on the ground with this giant pole like kind of clenched between your arms and your legs. You hold it with your whole body and like pull back a giant rubber band to launch the weight.
And then you got a rope.
Tree climbers all know this. They're like, yeah, that's how we do it. But
the big shot. Okay, so you got a rope with a weight on it or something. Mm-hmm. And then you launch, you're aiming. Is it easy to aim?
Not at first.
Okay.
No, I'm very pleased with myself. I could usually get like the specific branch crotch at like whatever height I was aiming for within 1 or 2 tries. By the time I had set, what did I have? 11 sights with 5 each. So I did a lot of them. And I did a lot of extra lines too my first year because I was also climbing in a bunch of places that I hadn't actually set my replicated bowls. So I set a ton of lines for this project. Long days. I would come home and feel worried that I'd thrown my shoulder out. And so you're aiming and, you know, it's like anything. I don't know. I found it easier because I don't think of like, I like athletic activity, but I don't think of myself as a hand-eye coordination kind of person. But I think because it's kind of a full body project, you can really guide the like very long pole. Anyway, it might be more detailed than you want.
No, I want more. Actually, so this thing goes over and then you've got to pulley up.
Mm-hmm. So you go around to the other side, you take the weight off, it detaches on the other end. And then you have some special knots. You attach your heavy duty, safe for human climbing, because this one's very, very slippery, so that it doesn't get tangled up in the branches. Also, if you misfire, you always take the weight off and pull it back without the weight on it, because if you pull that weight back up, it's almost certainly going to get tangled up in those twigs.
Gotcha.
So anyway, those are just details of logistics. Yeah, so you take that weight off, and then you tie your heavy, heavy rope on, and then reel it up, and then tie that one very, very safely with whatever system you're using, depending different climbing strategies.
A cafeteria tray with like what do the pan traps sit on?
So the way I did it was I actually used deeper cups than most people did. They're really just solo cups, and spray painted them based on Sam Jergy's Rex, but with a bigger cup. And then I punched holes at the top of each one, and tied P-cord, paracord. It's like the thin rope, and so I attached each one at a different level. Use that. So that they're hanging vertically one below the other. And I randomized the order so that like the white, blue, and yellow were at different orders. Yeah.
Did you want to redo that or something? Or is this something?
I just realized that I was using my hands to describe it, and that I realized I might not have actually been using descripting words that would make sense legibly.
You're made for radio.
I was like, oh, maybe I'm not making that clear.
No, I totally got that. Okay, so these get pulled up there, but then you like people run these traps usually for like, you know.
So I left them out for about a week, which is a little bit longer. It was just the fastest I could get back out to all of my sites again.
Yeah, it's a lot to get it back out.
And I actually, this year, I ran one of my sites daily, partially to see, obviously that's not replicated, but just to see if I was getting strikingly different numbers with a daily sampling versus collecting every week. And it looks like it's pretty much the same based on that anecdotal collection. I also did that because I was curious about a daily resolution of sampling,
fantastic.
Which was really cool. It was a farm near where I live, so it was easy for me to pop up there every day.
All right, that has got to be the most interesting tool that we've had on the show.
Oh, well, that's high praise. There have been some pretty awesome ones.
There have been some pretty awesome ones, but I have to say, nobody has the big shot.
It's a great tool. Sometimes I just call up a friend and I'm like, want to go climbing just so we can go set a fun line. So I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, and we got some pretty big trees in Oregon.
Yes, gosh, I know. Being out on the West Coast here, I'm like, who am I to say I have big trees? Like, these people know big trees, but yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Last question is, there's a lot of little bees you probably have seen. Does anyone sort of stick out in your mind as you really love that bee?
Yeah, I really love watching the nomada while I'm out, which is funny because I'm out in the forest all the time. Never seen one find an Andrina nest, but I'll keep watching. Yeah, and I think I just really love the green bees generally because I've started really watching them, and I have an undergrad who's really excited about the evolution of iridescence, so I've been paying way more attention to them than I ever used to, and I think that they're very beautiful.
Yeah.
I love a million bees. I love nomia. But in my system, I think I'd have to stick with Andrina as a genus.
Yeah.
But as a specific pairing, I really loved watching one nomada chasing this agapostemon down its nest last summer.
Oh,
so that was
really?
a highlight. Mm-hmm.
That's like a
Yeah,
strategy they have. Like it's like I'm gonna go down there and
So it didn't actually chase them.
I'm
Sorry.
gonna get beat up in the hole.
It waited until she left, which is
Okay,
more accurate
right.
to what we actually think. But it was
Okay.
a whole waiting for her to leave, and it was one of my growers called me and was like, "Gus," and I was like, "What's wrong? What happened?" He's like, "There is a whole agapostemon aggregation in my front yard, and there's green red bees all over them." And I was, "Oh my god!" So we went out and watched that for a while.
That's the most
so that
amazing
was a really
thing.
great time.
A grower calling you up with the actual genus name.
He didn't know the genus
Okay.
name, but we figured it out quickly. I was like, "Does it have a black abdomen or a green abdomen?" I was
Yeah.
like, "If it's got this stripy," and I was correct when I got
Fantastic.
out there. That's got to be an agapostemon. So
That is a
Yeah, it was
great
fun.
story in itself.
yeah, I mean, it's just the coolest things you end up seeing when you're out there, especially in a canopy space where people hardly ever are. I feel really honored to watch them up there doing their funny stuff. So
Well, fantastic. Thanks
Yeah.
for taking us up into the trees. I
thanks
really
so
appreciate
much.
it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with information discussed in each episode can be found at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. We'd also love to hear from you, and there are several ways to connect. For one, you can visit our website to post an episode-specific comment, suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at pollinationpodcast@oregonstate.edu. Finally, you can tweet questions or comments or join our Facebook or Instagram communities. Just look us up at OSU Pollinator Health. If you like the show, consider letting iTunes know by leaving us a review or rating. It makes us more visible, which helps others discover pollination. See you next week.